Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a topic that, well, it comes up a lot, often misunderstood, and frankly, rarely gets the detailed look it really deserves. Islam and women. When we're diving into the source material, Islam and women, rights, reality, and history. The idea is to get past the headlines,
Sure.
get a clearer perspective based on the actual texts.
Exactly. And for you, the learner, our goal today is pretty critical but focused. We want to give you a framework, really, to navigate this very complex landscape.
Yeah.
We're talking about the rights women were granted, the history of how those rights played out or didn't, and how that connects to today. The main thing, helping you tell the difference between authentic Islamic teachings and, well, the huge variety of cultural practices you see across the globe.
And the source material itself argues this distinction is vital, especially for non-Muslim audiences. It lays out, three big reasons why getting this framework right is so important.
It really is. First, you need these foundational principles to challenge, the pervasive misconceptions, stereotypes about women's roles that often get painted with a really broad brush, usually based on outliers.
Okay.
Second, having accurate knowledge just creates a better space for, international dialogue, talking about human rights, gender roles, things like that.
Makes sense.
And third, maybe most practically, it gives you the tools, the intellectual tools, to separate the original legal ideas, which were often quite progressive, from cultural traditions that came later. Traditions that might have added restrictions not actually required by the religion itself.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning then.
Right.
Because the source doesn't jump into legal codes first, it starts spiritually, which I think might surprise some people.
Right.
There's often this assumption, I think, that theological inequality is sort of the default starting point in major religions, but this material pushes back on that.
That's exactly where the core difference lies, according to the source. It argues for equality at the most fundamental level, and that really sets the stage for everything else. We can kind of break this down into three main pillars of religious equality.
Okay.
First, spiritual parity, the idea that men and women have equal spiritual worth, both created from a single source, both capable of reaching the highest spiritual levels.
So no inherent, defect or second-class status for one gender right from creation.
None whatsoever. Second pillar, divine accountability. Your accountability before God is purely based on your own actions, your choices. Gender doesn't factor in. A good deed gets the same reward, a bad deed, the same judgment. Simple as that. And third, equal religious duties, the core practices, prayer, fasting, charity, the pilgrimage, they were required equally for men and women.
That feels really powerful because you accept that spiritual starting point parity, equal accountability you've built in a kind of theological check.
Logically, it seems hard to then justify a strictly hierarchical legal system if the spiritual foundation is reciprocal, not based on subordination. It creates this inherent tension, doesn't it, that probably runs through later legal discussions.
Precisely. It sets a high standard.
Yeah.
So when you come across cultural practices that enforce really rigid hierarchies, this spiritual framework is an immediate challenge. You have to ask, okay, where did this rule come from if the divine setup is equal?
Okay, let's unpack that framework then and move into the legal and social rights, because this is where I think looking at the 7th century context, things get really revolutionary compared to much of the world at the time.
This is where the deep dive gets very specific, and history matters. We
Yes.
absolutely have to talk about economics, specifically independent property ownership.
Right.
The source is incredibly clear on this. Islam granted women the independent right to acquire property, own it, manage it, and dispose of it. Their wealth, their assets, earnings, investments, all of it. And here's the part that always jumps out at me, and I think surprises people. This right was granted without needing a male guardian.
Exactly.
No husband, father, brother needed to sign off or manage things for her.
That detail is the game changer, the revolutionary part. To really get the impact, you have to compare it to other societies back then.
Yeah.
Think about, say, Byzantine law, Roman traditions, early European legal systems. Women were often treated like legal minors. They couldn't make contracts on their own, couldn't sue, couldn't handle large amounts of property without a male relative acting legally for them.
So the 7th century Islamic provision just, boom, full financial autonomy.
Instantly, legally recognized.
She wasn't just managing the household budget. She could be a CEO of her own trading company if she had the means and inclination.
Absolutely. And right alongside that ownership comes the right to inheritance, explicitly laid out in the Quran. Women are guaranteed inheritance from parents, spouses, other relatives.
Okay, now this is where we need to tackle that nuance, the one the source brings up, because it often gets simplified, right, into just a soundbite.
Right.
The source acknowledges that, generally, women receive a smaller share than a male heir in certain situations, often half. We can't just ignore that. What context does the source give?
We definitely can't ignore it, but the source emphasizes understanding the whole 7th century system structure.
Hmm.
So yes, a daughter might get half the share of a son in some cases, but crucially, that male heir had the entire financial responsibility for the family.
Oh, okay.
He had to support his mother, his sisters, any dependents, and importantly, when a woman married, her financial upkeep became entirely her husband's responsibility. Her own property, her inheritance, it stayed hers,
Yeah.
completely hers. No obligation to spend it on the family.
So the different share isn't about her inherent value being less, but it's tied to who has the legally mandated financial burden.
That's the interpretation rooted in the texts, yes. It's an economic structure where the financial support duty falls heavily on the man. And we have to stress the historical leap here. Even if the share wasn't always equal, going from zero inheritance rights,
Which was common elsewhere.
exactly, common in pre-Islamic Arabia and many other places, going from zero to a guaranteed, mandated right to inherit, that was a massive step forward for women's economic security at the time.
That shifts the focus nicely from just managing assets you're given, like inheritance, to actually creating wealth. Which brings us to education and work.
Yes.
If a woman is an independent economic player, she needs the tools and the right to generate and manage that wealth, right?
Absolutely. And the mandate for knowledge is central here. The pursuit of education is stressed for all Muslims, men and women. The Prophet Muhammad actively encouraged both to seek knowledge, even if it meant traveling far.
That expectation itself suggests women were meant to be intellectual participants, not just, kept at home, which leads us naturally to the right to work.
And that right is completely supported by the economic structure we just talked about. Women have the right to work, to run businesses, earn a living. And just to hammer home the independence point again, those earnings, those assets are 100% hers to control. This wasn't just theory. The structure actively enabled, even required, women to be educated and financially literate to manage their affairs.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Because we can stop talking abstract rights and actually look at historical figures, people who live these principles, not as like weird exceptions, but as examples of the system working.
Oh, the historical examples are quite striking. You have to start with Khadija bint Khuwaylid, Prophet Muhammad's first wife.
Right, the businesswoman.
Not just a businesswoman, she was a major merchant, ran a huge international trade operation based in Mecca, managed her own capital, her own caravans, her own employees. This was before her marriage. She was exercising those property rights to the absolute fullest.
Incredible. And then there's Aisha bint Abu Bakr.
Yes. Also a wife of the Prophet, but known far beyond that. She became a major scholar, a huge authority.
How so?
She's one of the most important narrators of prophetic traditions, the Hadith. After his death, she essentially acted as a jurist, a teacher, for both men and women. Her intellectual impact was enormous, undeniable.
Wow. Okay, so commerce, scholarship, what else?
Well, to show the power of education combined with property rights, Fatima al-Fihri, 9th century, she used her inheritance, her own money, to establish and fund Al-Qarawiyyin.
The university in Fez, Morocco.
The very one, recognized as the world's oldest continuously operating university, founded and funded by a woman managing her independent wealth.
That's amazing. And wasn't there a female ruler mentioned too?
Razia Sultana, 13th century Delhi Sultanate, the only woman to rule it, wielded real political and military power. These examples, commerce, scholarship, institution building, political leadership, they span centuries.
It really demonstrates that the framework itself, the religious and legal foundation, could support women reaching the highest levels of public life, even if, cultural headwinds might have pushed back at different times or places.
Exactly. Their existence shows the potential within the original framework, regardless of later cultural interpretations or resistance.
And that potential, that influence, it definitely echoes into the modern world, right? When we look around today, we still see these rights, education, public contribution being asserted and exercised globally.
For sure. Think of someone like Malala Yousafzai, championing the universal right to education, which connects right back to that original Islamic mandate for seeking knowledge we talked about.
Right.
And you see political engagement. Figures like, say, Ilhan Omar in the U.S. Congress, actively participating in governance.
Or someone like Dalia Mogahed, a prominent researcher, consultant.
Yeah.
Her work on global Muslim public opinion. That's demonstrating that ongoing intellectual role contributing to policy to research.
Yeah, these contemporary examples show that the drive for public and intellectual engagement is still very much alive, even though obviously how these rights actually play out varies hugely depending on the country, the culture, the political situation they're in.
So what does this all mean? For you, listening to this, if I had to pick out the single biggest, maybe most surprising takeaway from this deep dive,
Hmm.
it has to be just how revolutionary those independent economic rights were back in the 7th century,
Hmm.
especially owning and managing property without needing a male guardian. That one detail really shakes up the standard story we often hear about women's status in the ancient and medieval world.
That is absolutely the critical point, and it
Yeah.
forces us to circle back to our mission at the start, the vital importance of distinguishing the foundational texts from cultural practices. When you're looking at the situation for women today, anywhere in the world, you constantly have to ask, is this restriction, this reality I'm seeing, coming from the core religious principles? Or is it from, centuries of cultural interpretation, local customs, political agendas that came much later, long after those initial economic rights were set down?
And that brings us to maybe a final thought, something provocative for you to consider, building right off that point about education and knowledge in the source material.
Okay.
Given that the pursuit of knowledge is mandated for everyone, male and female,
Mhm.
and given the historical evidence we just discussed, women like Aisha, like Fatima al-Firi, acting as top-tier scholars, teachers, founders of major institutions, what does that history really imply about the original expectation for women's engagement in public life, in intellectual life?
Hmm.
It suggests a pretty active role, doesn't it? Visible, authoritative even. Something to think about as you continue your own deep dive.